Hey. Gracias. Vemos más. No, vete aquí.
All right. Do I hear like the best person in the world right now?
Miss Queen Cancer, yes.
Sorry, good. What did you say? I missed it.
Miss Queen Cancer.
Oh, yeah. Yes, Josie. Oh, goodness. I think there's also students in here. Hello, everybody.
Gracias. Vemos más. No, vete aquí.
All right. Do I hear the best person in the world right now? I forgot there is feedback on my end.
I was like, this feedback is killing us.
You don't want to hear me say things twice?
I don't either.
Oh, but folks, I've said hello and you've not said hi back. So like Lillian, Noah, Skylar, Vincent, Eva, what's good?
Hello.
Nope.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning to you as well.
How are you doing?
You know, I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. I really appreciate that.
Great.
No one else wants to ask me how I'm doing? No one wants to say hi? No one wants to...
Hi.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I'm good. And yourself?
Oh, you know, can't complain. It's a Saturday. No one, y'all are dry on a Saturday. Whoops, out of the bed did you wake up on? Okay, hi, with the three eyes. Can y'all do me a favor? For this lecture, let's do videos on. You won't be pinned, but like, I feel like talking and looking, seeing people, especially for, you know, lectures of importance, is important. So let's do that. If you are able to, let's turn videos on. And I'm going to pin. So only one person is able to turn the video on right now. Skylar, Lillian, Eva, Noah, what's up? Hello, thank you.
Sorry.
And we're gonna, for folks who are watching, we are gonna get started soon. So just, you know, sit back, get a nice cold drink, grape juice, orange juice, apple juice, cranberry juice, and a snack, maybe also a pencil, a pen. Shouldn't be too relaxed, but relaxed enough. And we will, like I said, get started. I'll do the intro and stuff momentarily. The live stream is up. I'm going to copy that and put it in the thing. Taylor, you just let me know when you're good.
Okay, I'm going outside because it's time for Yossi's nap.
Oh, so she heard you.
Oh, I put her in her bed. She started crying.
She's like, excuse me, my world?
Yeah, right. What about me? I understand you have a million and one things to do, Mom, but what about me?
It's my world. But I will introduce and do the talky talk stuff. It takes like a minute or two. So hello, everyone. Welcome back to another workshop lecture presented by Debate Boutique. We are super excited to be able to offer this to not only our students, but to the students of the community who may or may not have the resources or the time to be attending summer programs, but still have an active interest, not both in debate, but also in education, knowing how systems work. Just having the information itself is power. So we love the fact that we're able to, you know, share that resource, and we think that it should become more of a norm. So this is definitely at other organizations. Release the docs, release the files, release the videos. You can share it. And so we'll be the first to do it. So with that being said, I'm very, look at Cindy wanting to join. Yes. Lillian, you or I will tell her to turn her camera on. Up to you, all right? Basically, Lillian, you're going to do the job telling Cindy it's that camera on life. But I'm super excited to be introducing this lecture today for a lot of reasons. This is Taylor Sanchez Guzman, who is not only a giant in the debate community, but is a mentor, leader, activist, and author, published author to an article that I will have linked in the description for you to read, which is focused on the kind of legacies of settler colonialism, looking at the film that a lot of y'all should be familiar with, Lilo and Stitch. If you have read the bio on the website, which if you've not been on the website, definitely take a peek. You'll see more about Taylor Sanchez outside of her, national competitiveness as both a competitor, but also as a coach in high school and college debate. I put a lot of the success of my college career on Taylor Sanchez because it's unapologetic for one. And it's the spreading of what is the truth. And so that is why I've asked the students who can to turn their cameras on out of respect for the lecture that is happening over settler colonialism, water as a tool of genocide, because we are, talking about systems of power, we're talking about interpersonal relations, and, it's nice to see a face that you're talking to than just a screen. And the last thing that I'm going to say, the last two things that I'm going to say, just because I'm me and I have things to say, is one, hire Black and brown folks to give these lectures. I'm quite tired of non-Black and brown folks talking about settler colonialism and telling best ways for what it means to endorse, understand certain epistemologies, or what is best for folks that they do not know, that they do not, do the research for. And so it's best that we start prioritizing that, but also paying that, compensating. And so new norms, because they're not the ones that exist right now, to start looking at institutions and putting that pressure on them to start reallocating their hiring process to make sure that Black and brown folks are not seen as fungible argument blocks in the system of the game that is debate. The last thing that I'll say on a more positive note, even though that was positive, is that you should be subscribed to the YouTube channel. Any of our students who are not subscribed right now who are watching, ooh, judgment on your mother, judgment on your cousin, judgment on somebody who you know somewhere down the line, judgment. But if you are part of watching the lives and you've been watching them for a minute now, subscribe, comment, like, post notification bell, follow us on Instagram, because we have a lot of content coming out, a lot of great content that has already happened, and it is only the beginning. So now that I am done talking, I'm going to hand over the hostship to you, Taylor, because I can't do share screen with multiple people. I don't know why, but you are now the host. Boom. And so you'll be able to share screen and all that good stuff. If you're talking and you're muted.
I am muted. I should share screen, right? Because of my PowerPoint. Okay.
Yeah. So I gave you the host. You're not the leader. So yeah, y'all, I'm done talking. I hope that you enjoy this. This is your notes. Can I get a paper check? Can I get a pencil check, a pen check? Because there should be a pen check. Red. Okay. Cindy, where the note check at? Where's the note check? Where's the your background makes it hard for me to see, but I'm gonna believe you. Vincent, where's the note check at?
I am typing.
Make it click on the
I
keyboard
promise.
to prove it. Okay. I'm gonna be asking for those real soon. But all right, y'all, I'm done talking. I know y'all are annoyed with me. I don't really care though. But enjoy this. Ask questions, y'all. Some of y'all read these arguments. Lily and Cindy, you've been telling me about these arguments that you want to read. This is the person literally to be asking. Like, if there was no better person to be talking about set call to, this is the one. Vincent, y'all read these arguments too. This is the person to ask. All right, I'm done now hyping up what is a legend in debate and one of the smartest people who I know. I'm done for now.
What if I don't live up to the hype? Okay, I haven't been in this world for a while now. I manage a restaurant, so I just wanted to first say thanks to Dewey Boutique, thanks to Jasmine, or Tlazo Kamate. It's the Nahuatl word for thank you. But I enjoy doing these, which is why I asked Jasmine to do this lecture, even though it takes me out of kind of what I spend most of my life doing, which is being a mom and also managing a restaurant, which is hard work, and working with different people every day and trying to help them be better people. But, you know, when it's all said and done, all of this stuff still matters in my daily life. And I'll talk a lot about that and why water and water protection, and sorry if there's like Southern trucks driving behind me that make a lot of noise, but you know, why water protection is a theme in my life and will continue to be a theme in my life, and why, you know, regardless of the kind of activities that happen every day in our individual lives, that water protection and settler colonialism are just truths about the world that exist, whether we think about them or not. And so the title of the lecture is Water as a Tool of Genocide, and more about the various manifestations of settler colonialism from the perspective of water protection. And I think that if you've seen me speak about settler colonialism in debate, or you heard my lecture last year, you know that the way that I talk about settler colonialism is very personal. And a lot of the time, the way that I talk about things is not the way that you'd expect to hear them spoken about. I talk about the personal a lot. Because I think that the way that structures manifest in our life are very important to speak about. And for me, you know, I don't think that this is going to be like the topic lecture that talks about, you know, various cases that have decided kind of where Native people stand on water rights in the US. And it's not going to be the one that gives a timeline and a history of kind of all of the events that have happened in the past 200 years or so between the US federal government and Native people, but it's going to instead be kind of developing the tools to be able to craft arguments about how we should think about settler colonialism. I studied film in college, and film for me was a way to get out of like the kind of how boring politics are, I guess. Because for me, everything is, you know, I want to kind of know more about the way that these things manifest in my life, which is not always necessarily political, but kind of the way that language and settler colonialism functions. It's why I speak English and why I had to learn Spanish, even though I identify as Chicano. It's why why Spanish is the most spoken word, or the most spoken language by Latino people, instead of the thousands of indigenous languages in Latin America, and why I have to relearn Nahuatl, even though it's the language of my ancestors, right? And so, you know, kind of the ways that, or the kind of microcosms of settler colonialism and how they kind of shape me and shape other people and shape our relationships to each other. That is more what I wanted to focus on. And so that's why I studied film. That's why I like doing these lectures, because these are things that are themes in our life, whether or not we think about them or not. So to kind of get started, if I can. Okay, so the objectives for this are: one, we're going to talk about water protection, by whom and toward what end. That's going to be more of a discussion of the US federal government and how it engages with water and Native people, what a water protector is, kind of from the perspective of like Standing Rock or like the pipelines that are being built, and kind of the kind of crossroads that we're at with pipelines, and how Native people are kind of rallying around that as a site of resistance. Two is settler colonialism, in other terms, created to put language to genocide and displacement. And so that is where I'm going to kind of more talk about settler colonialism in the theoretical sense, because I think that majority of what we know about settler colonialism in debate is treaties and treaty language and all about sovereignty, and less about kind of genocide, which is the impact of how settler colonialism manifests in our lives. If we're here, we still feel genocide, right? And so I kind of am more in the side of the settler colonialism kind of community, or like theory community, that prefers the language of genocide and displacement to a question of treaties and sovereignty, and I'll explain more about that. 3 and 4 are kind of together. They're local and global applications of this kind of theory, spots that are going to be relevant in debate, and this particularly with water as a topic. And number 5 is developing a critical lens through which we can develop arguments. And I think that we just need to kind of tie up some loose ends and be able to develop some type of way of engaging the world when we have this theory, because it's not enough to just say like, this is a problem. But in what way can we engage it in an ethical way when the whole world is genocidal, right? So more about me. I'm a mom. That's EOC. That's the one that I had to put to bed. And I'm a partner. I'm married. I came to Oklahoma and without the intention of getting married, and I ended up married, and now I'm here and staying here for the foreseeable future, I guess. I'm neurodivergent. I'm ADHD. Women tend to get diagnosed late in life, and that happened for me. So I got diagnosed last year with ADHD, and it explains kind of a lot of the way that I am and the way that I think about things. And kind of my loud and unapologeticness is probably owed more to that, because there's not a way when you're ADHD to like cover that up when you think things are just wrong. I'm mixed race. Semi-ambiguously brown is what I like to call myself when people are like, well, what are you? Chicana is the word for what I'm supposed to be, but I'm unclaimed. So being an unclaimed person means that I have no tribal belonging. Often in Native communities, the question, who are your people, means who claims you. I've been adopted into a beautiful community of Native people from various tribes being here in former Indian territory, or what's known as the state of Oklahoma, but I am tribeless. My family history is basically a question mark. So I'm Chicana, Mexican-American woman. To Mexicans, I'm more American than Mexican, and to Americans, I'm the other way around. My family calls ourselves Mexican because we have family that immigrated from Chihuahua and family that became American with the creation of the US border. We're from Southern Texas, and we got family recipes that are basically the best Northern style Mexican and Tex-Mex that you'll ever find, but we don't have a name other than Mexican, which is enough to signify other, at least in this land. I was born in Michigan, or Michigami, so that is the Ojibwe word for large water. I grew up with lots of access to water. 30 minutes from Lake Michigan is where I'm from. It's called Grand Rapids. And Grand Rapids obviously is named for the river that runs through the city. So we were 30 minutes from Lake Michigan with a major river running through our city. I had a creek in my backyard. Like, water was like a theme of my childhood. I loved swimming. I loved like just being in water, right? We were able to drink our tap water, and I loved everything about it. But then I moved to Oklahoma, and Oklahoma is a Choctaw word meaning the people. People incorrectly translate that to red people, but that's, again, a product of settler kind of translations of Choctaw words. Oklahoma has the largest variation of U.S. tribal representation after California, because California is obviously the biggest state, but also it has a history of Spanish settlement. Oklahoma was initially designated as Indian territory. So you'll hear a lot of like Native people from Oklahoma kind of talk about it as Indian territory, or it wasn't until I moved to Oklahoma that I learned that like Native people in the US call each other Indians, or they call it like Indian country or whatever, and that's like okay, right? But Indian territory was the legal and official term designated to Oklahoma before it became a state, where as the U.S. was settling westward, the official process of Indian removal removed folks from their land to here. So a lot of the southeastern tribes, the Muskogee, kind of those 5 civilized that fought for the Confederacy, the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, those are the most predominant tribes that you'll see in Oklahoma that were removed as a part of the Trail of Tears. But prior to Indian Territory designation, Oklahoma was home to many Southern Plains tribes. So here we have the Shawnee, we have, the Wichita, we have Comanche, who are Southern Plains. They're more so from Texas, but like I said, it's Indian territory. So as people kind of got removed and their lands got settled, everybody ended up here basically. So Norman, where OU is, where Jasmine lived for a while and where I live currently, is the land of the absentee Shawnee. Norman has a particularly interesting history of settlement. OU's mascot, if you didn't know, is the Sooners. During the land run of 1889, central Oklahoma was considered unassigned land, meaning that the land was not reserved for the tribes that have been removed. For example, those Muskogee Creek people that I was talking about earlier, the Muskogee Creek is one of those 5 civilized tribes. And their grounds are up in Okmulgee. That's like 2 hours northeast of here around Tulsa. Those are their grounds, right? So parts of Oklahoma were designated for particular tribes, right? Even though it was like general Indian territory. I live right by a stop sign. And maybe somebody, I don't know. Sorry. But so this place was kind of a free-for-all for settlers once they decided that maybe actually they did want it instead of giving it to the natives, right? And so the Indians Appropriations Act was a series of acts in the 19th century, with the final act being in 1889 that opened the lands up to white settlers under the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was kind of a land grant for folks where they would get so many acres as long as they live on, build and farm that land for 5 years, right? So it was all about building the settlement. So homesteaders were either the head of the household or someone who was 21 or older. And it did include anyone who was incorporated into citizenship. So as citizenship conferral progressed to include more groups and identities, those people could become homesteaders too. So the land run opened up with 2 million acres of unassigned land at noon on April 22nd, 1889. And the Sooners were the people who illegally sought out the best land prior to opening. The Boomers were the people who followed the protocols to settle after the 12 o'clock opening. So we say at OU, we say Boomer, and then the response is Sooner. Like when I went to Michigan State, people would be like, go green, and the response is go white, right? Here it's Boomer, Sooner, right? And the Boomers were basically the people who who were the ones who followed the protocols to settle after the 12 o'clock opening, but the Sooners are the ones who kind of cheated and moved and sought out that land prior to the opening, right? But enough about that. When I moved to Oklahoma, the lack of access of water was jarring to me. Like, don't get me wrong, like Flint exists and it's near and dear to my heart. Lake Michigan gets chromium pollution from Chicago corporation dumping all the time. And about 1/4 of the pipes in West Michigan are also lead lined, right? But we also had like certain lakes, like this lake called Gun Lake that's like close to where I'm from, right? Like sometimes the E. coli was so high that like you had to stay out, right? It was like, oh, there's like Gun Lake, you can't swim there this year because there's like too much pollution or like natural like bacteria growth or whatever, right? But like we could drink our tap water, right? And there wasn't like water pollution happens everywhere, and that's a result of just kind of the economic exploitation that happens just living in a settler colony that's, engaged in capitalist exploitation. But being in Michigan, there's this, like the slogan for Michigan is pure Michigan, right? Like we have lots of trees and forests and we go deer hunting, and deer hunting is or hunting opening day is like a holiday for most of the rural cities in Michigan. But like, so you could drink the tap water and you could swim in the water and it would be great. And there was no like negative connotation associated with it. But being down here was different because it's a landlocked state and it's the plains. So our closest lake here to my house is Lake Thunderbird, and it's the supply for Norman water. It's a body of water with one of the highest counts of chromium-6, which is a cancer-causing chemical. And I can't drink my tap water here, right? I haven't ever. And I can't risk it like I do in the north. But I have a water dispenser called a Primo that you put like 5-gallon jugs on. But our town has regular boil advisories, and I'm raising a daughter here, right? So like a few weeks ago, we had an E. coli advisory in the water supply. And so I was worried because I had an 8-month-old who would drink the water in her bathtub, right? But it's like the ways that water, once I moved to Oklahoma, became that much more apparent, just kind of how jarring the differences were between living in West Michigan and living in central Oklahoma. It's not that same level of access that you would expect, right? And so in fall 2016, I sat in on one of my friends' class with Dr. Kim Weiser. She was teaching a Native American lit class. Kim is now my medicine woman and my mentor, and I love her so much because when I sat in on that class, she basically claimed me as one of her own and invited me and some of my friends to Standing Rock with her over Thanksgiving break. So I'll talk about what happened there a little bit later, but water is something so near and dear to me. We say agua es la vida, or miniwichoni, or water is life, right? Miniwichoni was the phrase, the Lakota phrase of water is life that was popularized during the Standing Rock occupation. But for me, it became a movement of my life and tied all of the places I love together and all the people I love together. My entrance into Oklahoma at such a crucial time for the protection of Native lives, in which people were coming from all over the world to rally together. And the story about the land run and settlement of Oklahoma that I told earlier, that's what makes Cushing, Oklahoma, the pipeline crossroads. Because when settlers struck oil, they made a grab for Indian land, right? And that's kind of the theme of what happens under settler colonialism. It's the same thing that happened in the Black Hills, where Mount Rushmore is, or where what the Lakota call the Six Grandfathers. The first time the Treaty of Fort Laramie was broken was when they struck gold in the Black Hills. And what's important to note is that in all of these places, what the kind of protections that are allocated to Native people, whether through a treaty or some type of law that's allocated, that is being broken, right? And consistently being broken, right? You'll see on my Who Am I slide that it says BSK next to water protector. We called it Black Snake Killer because at Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is the one that is still being fought now, but when I was there, it's the Lakota prophecy of the Black Snake, right? The Dakota Access Pipeline is referred to as the Black Snake, and so the water protectors worked under the name Black Snake Killers. So it created a community of those who kind of rallied around resistance to the like foretelling of the prophecy, right? And like kind of when you were on Lakota land, you followed Lakota kind of not laws, but like protocol, right? What's that, like when in Rome, do as the Romans, right? But like more so of like out of respect for whose land you're on, right? As a way to kind of break the settler colonial ways that we relate to each other. We would talk like this, right? We would talk about where we were from and what land we occupied and kind of what land we were displaced from. And we would engage with each other in a way that was acknowledging that we were on Lakota land and we were there with the purpose, even though we were like trying to create a collective community that was fighting settler colonialism writ large, but we were on Lakota land. And that we needed to follow kind of the protocols of the Lakota. Okay. So water and land, and that protection is by whom and toward what end. So I'm gonna play this video because I love it so much, and you know, being a film person, that's what I gotta do. If it will load.
This unforgettable vacation memory, it didn't actually begin.
Sorry about the ad.
Here. This memory began when Dad booked his family's summer vacation.
I am your Redeemer. It is by my hand you will rise from the ashes of this world.
Get ready.
Do not, my friends, become addicted to water. It will take hold of you, and you will resent its absence.
LOL. Okay, so right, I love Mad Max because that movie is the bomb. Only that one, like Fury Road, was honestly that stuff. But hold on, sorry, I gotta get back to my presentation. I don't know. Okay, so in that scene, right, Emerton Joe, he is kind of the leader of post-apocalyptic Australia because Mad Max takes place in Australia. And he controls access to all the resources. And Fury Road is an interesting film because it is basically a critique of the way in which white men kind of control resources and deploy militaries to kind of fight for those resources, and how they basically will destroy the world through those types of that type of patriarchal politics. So if you haven't seen that movie, I would recommend watching it. I think it's rated PG-13. I don't know. But anyways, I love that scene because for me, for film, and the reason why I do film studies, and in the I guess article that I wrote that Jasmine linked in my bio, that was one I wrote a while ago, but I love just kind of looking at the costuming and those, you know, the shots and how fast they move and kind of where they choose to focus and what they say. And, you know, it's less about what happens and more how they tell the story. That is what's relevant for film theory. And in psychoanalysis, there's this concept, or in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there is this concept of the mirror stage, right? And Fanon used this concept to kind of talk about race in Black Skin, White Mask. He talks about kind of the ego fortification that comes through otherization, right? And so when you're kind of looking at the distinctions between Immortan Joe and being up on the cliff and controlling the access to water of the people who are below, and kind of how diverse the people at the bottom are, but also how they look, right? They look deformed, they look impoverished, they look desperate, right? Right, that kind of politics of water. And then when Immortan Joe says, don't become addicted to water, because you will become more like basically fiending for water in its absence, right? And so that's kind of the way in which I would say the status quo engages water as, even though it's life, right? As we say, Mini Wachoni, it is life. It is treated as a finite resource that is only accessible to those who can pay for it, or that some people are given certain privileges to it. I know that recently there was some things going on with Nestle bottling water for like $2 a day out of the Great Lakes while the whole Flint crisis was going on, and people were pointing out the contradictions of letting Nestle bottle that water, whereas like the people who live in Michigan have to get their water from lead-lined pipes that are killing them, right? And so that as like kind of an example, and then kind of thinking about the way in which the federal government has not only allowed special access to resources for corporations, but also failed to uphold their kind of treaty relationship under the trust doctrine. If we're talking about the breaking of the Fort Laramie Treaty, not only in the beginning when they struck gold in the Black Hills, but also again when they let the Dakota Access Pipeline be built on land that was, supposed to be protected for to use that verb, right, protected by or for the Lakota, right? If we think about the United States federal government as a protector, for me, I'm just kind of like, where is there a historical basis for water protection by the U.S.? Because if the Clean Water Act does not apply to Black and brown people, or if it does not apply to the poor, or if it does not apply to people who need it to survive, then in what form are they a protector other than for corporations, right? If they can't hold people accountable for poisoning their very populations with, certain, I guess, if we think about Flint or we think about the Dakota Access Pipeline, if they cannot kind of put their foot down or even hold people accountable after fact, if we think about like Rick Snyder and not being held accountable for what happened in Flint, then in what sense of the word are they a protector other than protecting it as a resource to make money off of and a regulator? Because being a regulator and being a protector are not the same thing. And so when we think about the phrasing, the United States federal government should, I think we can entertain the idea of what theoretically they should do. We know they should hold people accountable for poisoning bodies of water, and they should grant free access to water and treat water as a human right. They should not grant the easement of the Dakota Access Pipelines or the Keystone XL or the Enbridge 3 line or any of the pipelines that would result in the pollution of the people in the surrounding areas. But what they should do and what they actually do are often at ends. And so the question becomes, what historical basis is there for the federal or for the United States federal government to act, right? Because if the trust doctrine is a form of protection and is kind of the basis for sovereignty and how Native people kind of interact or tribes interact, I guess tribes in the sense, so when I say Native people, I mean like Native people in general. When I say tribes, I mean like the tribal structure and people who are recognized by the federal government, right? Because there are federally recognized tribes and there are non-federally recognized tribes. So when I say tribes, I mean the people who actually end up with their interests protected potentially because they can then have a conversation with the federal government and say, this is what we're asking of you, whereas people who are not recognized or are displaced or unclaimed cannot. And so when I say the trust doctrine is a form of protection for tribes, the trust doctrine is a kind of junior partner relationship that tribes have with the U.S. federal government where they can ask particular things based on the treaties. But as we see historically, those treaties continually get broken. And so, one, I think the United States federal government should not. But also, we need to think about who else can be water protectors, right? Native people are water protectors and have been since time immemorial. And what that means is since Native people began, right? And this is not any type of, we want to be careful to avoid any type of noble savage tropes about how wise Native people are and how we can learn from them to be better about our lives. But I think what's important to note here is that when settlers came to this land, Native people, what they saw, I guess, Native people were already having organized kind of structures to engage with kind of the natural world around them, right? And so whereas settlement kind of compares civilization, or like the settlement as civilization, right? Compares, you know, capitalism and the settlement that results from it to a quote unquote natural world or pre-settlement. The natural world is not pre-settlement. The natural world is pre-people and pre kind of social relations. Native people had social relations and labor roles and all of these things prior to settlement. And so the kind of what settlers saw when they kind of came to the US, or what is now known as the US, or came to North America, or whatever we want to call it, what they saw was what Native people had created, what they were doing as land and water protectors, right? People who felt an obligation to kind of use the land and use the resources that they had sustainably, through a different way of engaging with the environment than capitalist exploitation, right? And so when we think of protection, there are alternative ways of engaging with water that are not the status quo. And that is, you know, kind of using Native philosophy or Native kind of orientations to resources, which are going to be different kind of based on who you're reading. But there are different kind of Native philosophers who will talk about the different ways that Native people engaged with or thought about their environment prior to settlement. And that is kind of this response to, okay, so if not what's happening now, then what do we do, right? Or the kind of defeatist attitude that is usually the response to kind of critical approaches to the status quo. The response is, well, like, what else is there? You know what I mean? And so what we need to do is kind of think about the ways that Native people engaged with their environments, or kind of the civilizations that existed, or I hate the word civilization because it has so much baggage, but, you know, the societies that existed prior to settlement, and kind of how we can ethically engage with our environments and ethically engage with water protection, or water, to create an ethic of water protection that can kind of fight the exploitation that's happening now, right? And so I was going to talk a little bit about those major three pipelines that are at the bottom there: the Dakota Access, the Keystone XL, and the Enbridge Line 3. Those are three current pipeline fights that are happening in the US. The Keystone XL recently was abandoned as a project, but the Keystone XL project that was just abandoned was just the part, the southernmost part of the Keystone pipeline that was going to be constructed. Current parts of the Keystone pipeline exist in that place I was talking about earlier, the Cushing, Oklahoma, capital of pipelines, or crossroads of pipelines, right? That is one of the major kind of points of access for the Keystone pipeline. And it also demonstrates how it's a kind of transnational project, or how we can kind of open up into kind of global solvency or global kind of community around water protection, right? Because the Keystone Pipeline is not just a US project, but it's a Canadian project as well. And most pipelines are in North America. They usually flow through the entirety of North America, or at least are connected to some other pipeline. And so, you know, with the Dakota Access and the Keystone and the Enbridge 3 line, or Line 3, they are all, as you kind of trace the map in which those pipelines move across America or move across the US, you are moving through multiple territories or multiple kind of places that people were removed from, which may or may not cross borders, right? And so when I talk about kind of my history as like an unclaimed person, or my ancestors kind of being displaced by the US-Mexican border, when you talk about settler colonialism, the United States federal government being kind of the sole actor, ignores the way in which settler colonialism happens, right? Because Lakota land and Ojibwe land and Mohawk land and Tohono O'odham land, these are all tribes that their kind of territory is, or their lands are across settler borders, right? So the northernmost tribes that are having fights against pipelines, they're also in Canada, right? And they're blocking, the Mohawk are blocking trains and railroad constructions in Canada, but they're also in northern New York. There are, you know, the Lakota are also fighting the Keystone Pipeline, the Enbridge Line 3, that's in Minnesota, right? The Tohono O'odham is their lands cross the US-Mexican border, but a lot of the conversations around immigration impact them in the border wall, because it crosses into Mexico, right? And so when we talk about settler colonialism, we need to be thinking about kind of who's being displaced and where those lands are, because if it's a question of whether or not the United States federal government should act, it limits kind of what potential solutions there are if we're looking towards a settler government, because the limitations of their kind of jurisdiction might not be able to encompass kind of all of the people that, or all of the lands that may need kind of retribution or some type of support or protection, if that makes sense. Let's see, what else? Okay, I'm going to talk about settler colonialism kind of like at large, I don't know, in the general sense. So colonialism in general, not settler colonialism, but colonialism, is the structure of the colonizer and the colonized that maintains the separation between the foreign and the indigenous. I would say a large part of colonization of Africa and Asia falls in this category. India is a good example of it, because colonialism in India was ruled by the British from a distance. So settler colonialism, on the other hand, is a structure where the colonizer settles into the place to become indigenous through eradication efforts. So Australia, the Americas, South Africa is a good one as well. New Zealand, those are all examples, right? Patrick Wolfe has been regarded as an important author on settler colonialism and how it functions globally, not so much in the US, but like I said earlier, he is, or did I talk about him earlier? I don't think so. Anyways, good person to talk about Australia. Patrick Wolfe is best known for his theorizing of settler colonialism as a structure that maintains the society erected by settlers on a particular land base throughout time, not a singular event of the past that marked the arrival of settlers as commonly thought, right? So in general, colonialism is, or settler colonialism is thought as when they arrived and now the land is settled and boo-hoo, the natives are gone, right? But writing in 2006, Wolfe argued settler colonialism destroys to replace. So settler colonialism, according to Wolfe, exists in a paradox. In order to justify the settlement, settler society requires the elimination of indigenous people and their lifeways. However, indigenous people become the existence, or their existence becomes the very yardstick used to measure progress and difference. So for Aboriginal people of Australia, The ideological justification for indigenous dispossession was that settlers could use the land better than they could, not that settlers had been on the land primordially and were merely returning home. Wolfe identifies the way that the modern progressive government of Australia continues to incorporate the indigenous aura to geographical features and symbolism in various industries and infrastructure, including film, as an example of the latter feature of this paradox. The latter portion elaborates a condition of racial justification for power as native is not solely an inherent marker of relationship to land, but it's constructed out of relationship to settlers. So the indigenous are racial. They're red, black, brown, depending on where you are. So in Australia, indigenous people they're called Aboriginal, and they're regarded as black. In the US, the kind of racial codification associated with Native people is red or brown, kind of depending on who you're talking about. Brown tends to be associated with immigrants more so, but people that are native to kind of Central or South America. And that's kind of where like my family and my family's legacy comes from, is that we're not so much red, but we're more brown. And that's where that kind of Mexican title kind of stands in for being native, but also foreign. But so this reveals that the single most important facet of settler colonialism is not the land for expansion, but it's genocide and clearing in order to gain access to such land. Settlerism kind of is that theory of bodily relation. And so this is the more recent kind of developments in settler colonialism out of its kind of relationship with Afro-pessimism and Black theory. Settlerism is not a term I don't think that you'll see in the literature, but settlerism kind of gets to less about the land and more about the people, because I think Tiffany King, obviously if you know me or you know Jasmine, we have talked about or used her work a lot. Settlerism is the laboring on the body of the people that are trying to be removed, right? So it is the physical relationship between one body and the other. And so settlerism is derived out of Wilderson's concept of the triad, the human master, settler, savage, slave relationship. Tiffany King has written extensively on the visual schema of the triadic relations, so red, black, and white in North America. King utilizes the concept of terra nullius to demonstrate how land is not an inherent good or resource, but constructed ontologically to nature for the settlers. So modernity has established this noble savage trope for the First Nations by viewing primordial status as savagery, and ultimately, Native people are incarcerated by their temporal relationship to land. So this is where water protection becomes a justification for genocide, right? So basically, because Native people are seen or coded as savages, right? Because of their relationship as seeing themselves as protectors, or you'll hear the word steward, stewards of the land, that becomes their kind of time. It becomes a time relationship where Native people are stuck to the past and cannot exist in the future and cannot coexist with civilization, right, or settlement. They have all these old ways that don't longer fit into modernity, right, and then just becomes the justification for their eradication because they're living in the past, right? And so if it can't coexist with the future, the new great thing, what we're trying to do, then they got to go, right? And so savage nature forecloses one's ability to be incorporated into civilization, the basis of elimination of the native. So that's King. Along with Native communities, cultural artifacts and lifeways are eliminated over time, denying important factors for kinship ties to Native people. So if we think about, like, I don't know, Killmonger's scene in Black Panther, and the kind of attempt to reclaim the artifacts of their people, right? Museums kind of hold that relationship, kind of bind up that relationship, because they steal these kind of items of importance or cultural important items and put them in museums. And when we think about museums, it's kind of like a window into the past, right? And so it kind of maintains that voyeuristic relationship that settlers have with Native people, where you can look at these artifacts and think, wow, how great that these people lived this way in the past, but it has no relationship to my life now, right? Because, you know, I got these iPads and people to do these things for me, and I can go through the drive-through and those types of things, right? But how great that people used to grow their own food, right? And so this type of protection, resurgence, and kind of resistance to this, or these like savage tropes, is to almost engage in that trope, right? And to be a water protector or be a land protector. What else? So the terra nullius is a 0 degree of social conception for nature that enabled it to be transformed and packaged into commodities. So once natives are cleared from the land, literally by being incarcerated into nature, so when you're dead, you get buried in the land, manipulation of an expansion across land is the limitless sight line of the settler, and time is infinite, but only linearly from the point of contact. So once the natives are gone, there is infinite possibilities to expand westward. So when we talk about kind of Indian removal and the removal process and the Trail of Tears, right, and the settlement of Oklahoma, once natives are removed from the land, the possibilities, or seeing land as kind of a building block for civilization, it creates those infinite futures, right? It creates them through kind of using the resources in the land as a point of extraction to kind of create your future, and kind of use all the things on the land as a way to, as like kind of a building block to get there, right? But Native people have to go first, right? And so King names this process as a rooting in order to launch. So settlerism is about the making and unmaking of bodies in various ways that construct our social world. And this is where the kind of tropes that exist of the settler master, savage, and slave become racialized. So this is going to get messy. So I'm going to kind of define those and contextualize the term. So indigeneity. It's a global concept that refers back to the structures of colonialism that were discussed previously. So like that first level of colonialism, right? Indigenous is a concept of just belonging to a place, right? So when we have Indigenous Peoples Day, we are not necessarily talking about settler colonialism or settlerism in the US, right? Because if we were, then there would probably be a lot less discussion of like the Indigenous peoples of Europe, right? But under settlerism, indigeneity, according to King, is always shifting. So the point is to eradicate Indigenous, not just from the land, but erase them from ever existing in order to claim oneself as Indigenous. So there are literally people in the world that think that Native Americans no longer exist, that exists in Oklahoma, right? There are people that are like, oh yeah, those Indians that used to exist, right? So that's important for the homesteader or the settler to be able to indigenize themselves to the land. And Americans are the indigenous now, which is how we can see like the border debate developing around like xenophobia, right? The foreigners become the ones on the outside of the settlement. So if you want more on this, Jasmine can probably help you with this. This is Frank Moten's concept of encirculation, where the sovereign establishes the limits of who, what, where, and when, and they claim the land, and now they're the indigenous, and the previous indigenous are dead. The savage are now the foreign, and what you see is a large movement of poor indigenous folks moving from the south of the US-Mexican border to the north after years of that kind of settling and creation of like the nation state, right? So where I think that it gets messy is native, right? When we use the term native, because native can kind of be synonymous with indigenous, but I think in current politics, it gets messy because there's not a discussion of genocide. There's not a language for genocide, and that's on purpose, right? But so when we want to talk about genocide, we want to use very precise terms to mean who we're talking about, because if we are talking about people who are killed off in order to be replaced, then this, $5 Indian, my grandma was a great or my great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess, right? Those people, right? We need a way to differentiate between who claims to be Indigenous and who is experiencing the impact of genocide, right? And I think that not all Indigenous people, and this is where it gets kind of crazy, not all Indigenous people experience genocide, right? Because there are non-Indigenous people that experience genocide as a result of being displaced or unclaimed or detribalized, right? And so when we talk about settler colonialism, we really have to parse out the structures and the kind of different things that are at play. So if, there is a structure of federal recognition where in a trust doctrine relationship, right? When I talked about earlier about how some tribes have voices more so than others, to kind of use this trust doctrine to their advantage, those are federally recognized tribes, and people who are enrolled in those tribes, they include not only people who historically, have legacy in those tribes, but also, their adopted family members or people who have married into those tribes and their children, or people who, those kind of like that intermarrying that happened a lot in Latin America, but Latin American politics get even more messy on this, but just kind of the expansion of the official nation, tribal nation, right, does not necessarily mean that every single one of those people is racialized as Native. And so when we talk about settlerism and how one person can say the cop killed that person or incarcerated that person because they were Native, refers to kind of their very being, right? And so the ontological level of settlerism is more about kind of the racialization, and more along the lines with kind of Afro-pessimism and what it means to be a red person, right? So red, white, and black, right? So we know that cops identify Black people as whatever tropes they are associated with Blackness and use that as a justification to murder them. That is kind of a similar way in which genocide functions, that there has to be a way to kind of identify people as needing to be eradicated, right? And so redness is kind of the language that people are putting to settlerism to kind of define or name the people who have been genocided or no longer exist or have been displaced or unclaimed or are the other of sovereignty, right? Because sovereignty is a concept that is only allowed to a political kind of organization, like a tribal nation, right? That's not to say that there aren't people who are on the inside and outside of tribal nations, because there are. It's just that when you say Indigenous, it does not mean the same thing as what settlerism or what, when you say Native or red, would mean. Native American kind of overlaps those things, but it's more on the side of Indigenous. So you kind of have to parse out your terms when you're developing your argument about settler colonialism, because this can get very, very, very confusing very quickly, especially if you're debating people who also talk about settler colonialism, right? And you're trying to establish a link wall, or you're trying to establish a link differential, right? And it's like, yeah, like we also care about settler colonialism. Like we're all about like Native rights and all that good stuff. And you're like, no, but I'm talking about like people who don't have access to those rights because they don't exist, right? Like they are dead. If they existed before, they no longer exist, right? Because there are tribes that no longer exist, right? They have become extinct as a result of genocide. So, that's where I think that when we talk about settler colonialism, that the kind of more radical wave, it can become a link differential in debate, but it can also become a point of contention where in like everyday organizing, right? Because then you become unruly when you kind of take that more radical radical language of genocide and less of sovereignty, because it's less palatable, because it's not something that is easily achievable. You cannot redress genocide because people are literally dead and we don't know their names and we can't get their languages back, right? So it becomes a lot harder to kind of discuss genocide, and people get angry about it, right? But to be able to kind of have a future, we have to have a language for it, right? And so that's kind of a precursor to engaging any type of way politically with the world, because language is how we formulate our thoughts and formulate our ethics and formulate all of those types of things. And it defines what then becomes politically possible. If we can't have a language to describe the problem that we're talking about, and we just default to kind of the terms in which settlers have given us, speaking in English, speaking in terms of sovereignty, speaking in terms of honoring the treaties, I could care less about the treaties, right? I would like people to not be killed anymore. And that is not founded, that foundation does not exist solely in the treaties. It exists solely because these are people who never deserve to die or be violated in the first place, right? And that's kind of this grammar argument that it came to light during the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? And so when I went to Standing Rock, well, first let's talk about what happened, right? So prior to when I went to Standing Rock, there were a ton of these videos that you can probably still find online of the people who were initially forming the resistance earlier in the year. This was during the summer and in the spring. And basically where the Dakota Access Pipeline initially had a different route. It was gonna go through a white neighborhood, because majority of the people that live in North Dakota are white outside of the native, like outside of the reservation, right? And so when they said, hey, we're gonna put this pipeline in your backyard, and they're like, no, you're not, right? They're like, oh shoot, well, I guess we gotta move this pipeline, right? So where can we put it, right? And then when they started reformulating the route for the Dakota Access Pipeline, it started going through the Standing Rock Reservation. And that's why the movement is called Standing Rock, because it's the Standing Rock Reservation. When that was met with resistance from Native people, what happened was they started sicking snipers and police and dogs on people and people with children and their children, right? And so there's videos entirely of like these contractors like with dogs. And when I was there, we participated in a ceremony over on one of the islands that was off of, so that it's kind of like in a valley, where the camp was. It was kind of in a valley. And we were participating in a prayer ceremony over on the island where water was surrounding us, but there were police up on the hill, right? And during this prayer ceremony, there were snipers that were pointing guns at all of us while we were having this ceremony. And that tells you like how threatening it is to even exist or even to say no, right? And so the power to refuse, right? That becomes something that is super important, because you can't choose what you can't refuse, right? But if you develop the power of the word no, right, or to even to say, you have to prepare for the violent reactions of the settlement, right? And so for people who are supposed to be dead and dying and on reservations with lack of water or lack of clean access to water, because most people on reservations don't even have water, like a lot of them do not have access to water, much less clean water, right? That to say no and to resist another attempt at murder or slow death of people who live in these areas, that's unacceptable, right, to the settlement, right? And so when we see later, after these fights and after I returned home and after all of these things were happening, Obama had stopped the easement, right? He kind of periodically or like temporarily, that's the word I'm looking for, words are hard, temporarily stopped the construction of the pipeline. And people thought it was a win. And they were like, yeah, like we did it, you know. And here we are in 2021, July 2021, and a Dakota Access Pipeline protester just got sentenced to 8 years in prison. And so it goes back to that discussion of why should they, if there's not, why should we get our hopes up for them to act ethically? Because when they do, it just goes back the other direction. It's not permanent. It's not long lasting, right? So I think like something that's implicated by protection, or the word protection, is that the person who's receiving the protection probably has to feel protected, or feel that, you know, it's permanent, or that it's at least some type of long-term care. That's not care, right? Sending people to prison, the kind of raiding of the camp that actually broke up most of the resistance during that major time when it first started in 2016, 2017. There is no element of care there. There's no element of protection, right? And so what does it mean to protect people with just laws? Or to even like think that there could be a law that could protect not just water, but Native people's access to water, or Native people in general, right? It is at odds with settlement, right? The only reason reservations exist is because of that terra nullius stuff that I was talking about earlier. It's to point at the reservations and say, oh yes, okay, so Native people, you exist there and you gave us this land, right? So this is ours, that's yours, right? And it doesn't matter that people on reservations are dying slow deaths and existing in polluted communities. They solely exist as an example of they are the people who told us that the rest of this is ours, right? And so settlement kind of exists in all these different weird paradoxical ways. But, you know, that is kind of how the relationship of settler colonialism is around water. We'll go to the next slide. So global and local uses of settler colonialism. So on the local level, there's some things that I think that we should talk about. First is that Standing Rock is a unifying moment. That was spectacular. I met so many people from so many different countries around the world, not just different like tribal communities, but like there are people from Russia, from Europe, from different places all over the world. People came from Mexico to go to Standing Rock. It was a point of unification, right, around a single cause, which is that water is life, right? Not water is a human right, but water is life. It is the very essence of life. And so we should protect it, right? Which doesn't go to, please protect our human right. It goes to, we have an inherent and divine cause that is, if water is life, then we're here to protect it, right? Which is outside any kind of jurisdiction of government, right? And so kind of using that as a unifying moment, it was one of those global hotspots, which is what we're seeing with Palestine and other places around the world. A few years ago, it was South Africa, and kind of the people in South Africa taking their land back from white people's farms in South Africa, right? There's a ton of hotspots globally and fights over settler colonialism, and the internet does well to kind of like, I don't know, spectacularize these things, but it can become a unifying moment, even if it is a spectacle, for people to kind of rally around those moments and those places as a moment of fighting settler colonialism in all of its ways. Because if Israel is disbanded, or if something happens with this Israel-Palestine conflict, it doesn't mean that settler colonialism goes away, because it constantly is a form of remaking itself globally, right? Not just in the US, but globally, right? And it's a relationship that exists that's not pinpointable in one singular place, right? And so it's important to have all of these coexisting fights against settler colonialism. It's not like we got to win the war type of thing. It is a constant struggle to engage in a more ethical relationship with each other and the world, and build a community that is against kind of all of the characteristics of settler colonialism, right? Something I wanted to highlight was things like territorial disputes. So those are local because they are territories of the US, right? I put Hawaii in here because obviously I've written, Jasmine wrote or mentioned the Lilo and Stitch stuff that I've done. And if you're interested, I can also send you that. I wrote an unpublished paper. It never got published because I didn't end up going to grad school. I ended up managing a restaurant instead. But I wrote a paper about this very concept and community and Lilo and Stitch, and how kind of the Galactic Federation and Lilo and Stitch is parallel to the way that the US builds its global empire, and that Lilo and Stitch are both fugitives of both of those respective empires that are trying to create their chosen family and their fugitive family. So if you're interested in that, you can email me. My email will be at the end of this PowerPoint. But Hawaii is a big place to kind of talk about how water becomes a source of domination. There is the history of the Cook Islands, is what Hawaii was originally called, and how Captain Cook kind of was searching, trying to map the constellations and stumbled on Hawaii, and that's how it kind of paved the way for settlement, and that the ocean is used as a source of, domination, and kind of, what was the word that Tinsley used? Tinsley is a queer Black author who was popularized quite a few years ago. I want to say almost like 10 years ago now. They wrote about cross currents and how the ocean has been used as a point of hegemonic domination globally, and it has been used. So water has been used genocidally, or has been used for domination, whether it's like conquering the Americas or conquering Hawaii, or any type of way that water can be used. But that's something to seek out. Puerto Rico is another one of those. There's a large debate that has been going on for years in Puerto Rico about whether or not they should become a state, but they're an occupied territory. Guam is another one of those, right? Occupied territories in the US that are supposed to be sovereign nations, but are kind of, some of them, so Hawaii is a state, but it was originally a kingdom, right? A sovereign kingdom. But Puerto Rico and Guam are more of owned territories that don't have any type of say in the government or any type of laws that they're governed by because of lack of statehood, which is kind of the source of the statehood argument that's happening in Puerto Rico, which we can see what happened with the hurricane and the lack of obligation felt by the federal government to do anything in response to the massive storms that were happening in Puerto Rico and the damage that it caused while Trump was in office, right? And then global, right? So that transforms into the global kind of hegemonic uses of water and the way in which we build the empire. I just put Patrick Wolf's name there, but I've already talked about him, so I'm not going to talk about him more. Lastly, I've kind of implemented it. Like I said, I'm more of a fan of kind of talking about the microcosms and the way that settler colonialism manifests in our lives. And so a lot of the work I've done around kind of how to resist settler colonialism is through building community, because I think it really is a way of orientating yourself towards settler colonialism in a series of choices that we make through the day. It doesn't mean that like it's solely all immaterial, because it's important to get people who have lack of access to water to get them access to clean water. But right, so just like Tuck and Yang say, decolonization is not a metaphor, and it will never be a metaphor. There is no stand-in for decolonizing. solely decolonization means decolonization. It means unsettling the land, right? And so if you want to take kind of the more radical approach, then decolonization is not a metaphor, is a great way to kind of push back against like this idea that treaty rights and recognition will somehow undo the wrongs of the past, right? And that land acknowledgements are not a stand-in for decolonial work. So that's been a common one recently. Land acknowledgements have popped up everywhere. So I'm a big fan of like, putting language to, the stuff that we're talking about, to problems, right? As I've talked about earlier with like the genocide stuff. Land acknowledgement, however, does nothing to undo genocide. Like I said, it's basically the function of the reservation. Yes, those Native people, they were here once, but they no longer here. How sad that they are gone, but they're gone, right? And so it's not a stand-in for decolonial work. It's important to be aware of kind of what land you stand on. But, like I said, at Standing Rock, we were building more of a community to engage with each other in a way that was still respectful of the Lakota land that we were on, right? It wasn't we're on Lakota land. Glad we said that, no, we were on Lakota land, and thus we had to respect the ways of the Lakota. I'm not a big fan of wearing skirts, but I had to wear a skirt to ceremony, you know what I mean? Because that was the way of the people that I chose to be a visitor in there. They welcomed me in as a visitor. And if I didn't like it, then I needed to leave, right? And then building community and language and connection. So this is kind of what I talk about in my, what I talk about in that article that I wrote about moving with the dead, but kind of building a relationship to those who have been victims of genocide, right? And developing a language to kind of talk about genocide and a theory of it, which is kind of the more Afro-pessimist take, that we need to develop a language to kind of talk about the thing that we're talking about, or otherwise there's no like kind of material possibilities to even kind of resolve it. But that a connection and an ethical community is built through building that relationship and through building that language. I'm sorry, I don't have any more like kind of specific examples, but I'm open to kind of giving feedback on whatever you all come up with based on whatever research that you do or whatever direction you kind of want to take your arguments if you want, because I'm going to be on vacation for the next 10 days. Thank Creator for that. So I am done. That's it for that. So here's my email if it wants to pop up. Yeah, there's my email. I'm taylorsanchez@gmail.com. It's very easy. I'm a very busy person, but I always check my email because I'm ADHD. So I just like gotta like do stuff while I'm doing other stuff. So I would love to give any type of feedback or help, you all develop these arguments or answer questions. And if you like completely disagree with me, that's cool too. And we can talk about it if you want. But yeah, that's what I got for you.
Before they ask any questions, I'm going to stop the live stream because live stream, y'all don't get access to that. Should have registered. Should have showed up. So let me end. Oh, can you make me the host so I can end the live stream? Also, if you are watching the stream, don't email Taylor.
What? Oh, my bad.
No, I'm just saying like these.
They're going to send me hate mail. That's cool too, I guess.
Okay. Don't do it. That's a fake email address.
Whatever.